This is CEC Gurukul series, and under this series we are running a lecture pattern called the English novel, and we have covered so far a number of writers and texts starting from the beginning of English fiction, and these days we have come up to the 19th century. Maybe there are some texts still left of the 18th century. They also will be covered whenever we have a chance to take them up. Today's lecture would be on Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, and it is called Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, A View. Now, I am assuming that all of you are students of literature, but even those who are not would like to know about this novel, because this is not exactly of the interests of the specialist. It is also of great interest for the general reader, in today's time. Emily Bronte, as the name suggests, is a woman writer, and she wrote this novel. There are certain things that I have to tell you about the 19th century fiction, particularly written by women. Emily Bronte could not publish a book in her own name. Not that she didn't like or she didn't want, but that people would not take a woman writer seriously, and publishers, would look down upon women if they, for them pretended that they wrote, because they would be writing very simple stuff, thought the publishers. But Emily Bronte was a different kind of a writer. She wanted to share a very intense story with the readers of the day, and in order to publish and to be taken seriously, she assumed a name. Now, assuming a name in English is called using a pseudonym, the wrong name, the difficult name, the false name. And the name that she adopted, she got it for herself, was Alice Bell. So Alice Bell is a male name, and if she sent the manuscript to a publisher at the time, then that publisher would take the script for its merit and would not have any prejudice against the writer, because the writer was a male. So that was the trick that she used, and she published this novel. This novel was published in 1847, just the middle of the 19th century. Let me tell you a few things in brief about this author. She was born on 30th July 1818. This is the beginning of the 19th century, and she was born in a place called Haworth, and it was in England. And she died of tuberculosis on 19th of December 1848. So she lived for, let's say, 30 years and 6 months. And that is no age to die for an author. Authors live long, and because they are sensitive people, so they start early, but they gain in depth and maturity as the time passes. And around 40, they would be in their prime. But she didn't have that chance, and that if somebody had tuberculosis in the 19th century, there was no cure for it, and sooner or later, and generally sooner, the person would die. And it was a disease, that must have taken away a large number of English writers in the 19th century. The other example that I can straight away refer to is of John Keats, who also died of tuberculosis, and around the same time as she was living. He was senior to her, let's say, and but he died very early in life, as early as she would have. So think of this tragedy. The only thing is that if somebody had tuberculosis, then one would die, gradually. One would lose control over oneself. The disease would, spread slowly but certainly, and the person generally became very sensitive in oneself. And you can say that the people who had, got tuberculosis would be very impressive in their talk, very, very impressive in their behavior. They would also look very, very, very charming from a distance, but then there was a disease and one could not do anything about it. She wrote under the pseudonym, as I have already said, Alice Bell. Her father, Patrick Bronte, was an Anglican clergyman. So this word I would like to explain. It's a clergyman, it's a person from the church, and does service there, and it's an Anglican church to which the father belonged. Now, Anglican is a word that I would like to explain in one or two sentences. Anglicanism started from the Reformation in the 16th century. When the reforms occurred, it was called Reformation in Christianity in the 16th century. Then there were two branches of Roman Catholicism. One was the Roman Catholicism itself, and the other was of the Protestants. But Protestants, were spread all over Europe, and those Protestants who were there in England, they had to also keep in mind not the interests of religion, but also of society. So they said, so far as we are concerned, we are English Christians, and we have certain pressures of society on us, and we would not follow the Bible as well as one might, and we will make some changes here, if not in the dictum, if not in the theory, if not in the approach, at least in our behavior. So an English version of Protestantism is Anglicanism, and her father was that way, an Anglican person at that time. So he would keep an open mind on Christianity. He would not be as sharp as Protestants were, and he would understand the weaknesses of people, and he would be sympathetic towards them. So that's the kind of heritage that this person had. I'm just saying in passing that so far as the daughter of this Patrick Bronte, I'm talking about Emily Bronte, was concerned, she did not take Christianity as seriously and as devotedly as her father would have, or as others would have. She was a person with an independent mind, and if not directly, if not consciously, at least subconsciously, she would be a humanist than a Christian. So Emily was educated mostly at home. In those days, the education was not spread. It was not public kind of education, and people would sometimes, just sit at home. They would read books, and a tutor may be called if one could afford a tutor to come to home. And in that case, Emily Bronte, as a person of education, was self-made. Then there were three sisters in the family, and all three were writers. Anne Bronte, Emily Bronte, and the writer of Charlotte Bronte. These three were there, and all were writers, and they grew up together. They were separate from each other by a couple of years, and they all wrote fiction, they all wrote poetry. Charlotte Bronte, the writer of Jane Eyre, would be writing regularly, and their pastime was, their hobby was that they would tell romantic tales to one another, and these tales they would just invent, they just think of at the spur of the moment, and they would just relate the tale to the other sisters. This was a game for them. So I would, if I have siblings, then I would like to say something that I want to say, and I'll build a story around it, and that story then will engage the interests of the listeners, and next day there will be a story done in the same manner by somebody else. So the point that I'm making is that these children, when they were growing up in the household, then they became very active mentally and intellectually, and their imagination became very sharp in the process, because every day they would either think of a new tale, or they would hear a new tale by the other sisters. So this was a game being played, and that would have played its part in the making of these persons as writers. And in the 19th century, one could write poetry, and all of them wrote poetry. But there was also, a habit in those days, a kind of trend that had occurred in the 19th century, and that trend was of telling stories. And stories can be told better when one uses prose. So prose fiction had become very popular in the 19th century. So they wrote in prose, and the poems that they wrote were separate, but then they tried their hand generally at telling a story, and telling a story was an established tradition in England in the 19th century. So they had read a lot at that time, and then along the same pattern or something slightly different, they would write a story, and if they had a good imagination, then that story can appeal to a large number of people, and that's how the books were published. So Wuthering Heights was published in 1847, as I have said. Under her pseudonym, the novel offered challenges to Victorian morality and religion. This novel that way is famous. It does not accept the moral principles of the Victorian period. If somebody is in love, and if somebody wants to have some independence, if somebody has some hidden desires, those hidden desires can be brought forth on the page by the person, and that person may not be liked, may not be approved of by the fellow citizens, by the readers of the day, because people generally showed themselves as moral. Now, when one says Victorian morality, then there is something negative attached to it these days. Victorian means superficial. So morality only in passing. That is, in your words you are moral, but in your behavior you can be as bad as anybody. So that is what is Victorian morality popularly known as. And so far as religion is concerned, as I have already indicated, she was not very strict adherent of religion, and she would have her own principles to follow, her own norms to think about, and she would not take command from, for instance, Anglican Church, to which her father belonged. And when you write a novel, then you think of many characters, and if you are a moralist, if you believe in religion, then there are certain things that you would not think of, and therefore your novel, the story that you write, the story that I write, would be superficial and shallow, because you would be always considering human beings as adhering to a certain faith. In that case, how can you write realistically? How can you write about what goes on in the mind of a person? Because if you are a moralist, if you believe in religion, then you will say only that which is acceptable in society, and then many things will be left out of the purview. So Victorian morality and religion that were challenged by her through the novel, then that would be a positive angle of her writing. Then I come to the novel itself. She writes this novel in 1847. It is published. She must have been writing in 1845, 46, 47, and at that time she would be 27, 28 years old, and she would sit in a corner. She may not even tell her sisters that she was writing a serious stuff. She didn't have time to write any more novel. This is the only novel that she wrote. And there is one thing that will occur later on also in my lecture, but let me tell you that there is a kind of Gothic element in this novel. Now this Gothic element I'd like to explain. People in the late 18th century and early 19th century started saying, and also feeling of course, that life is not all that is visible. If you see your home, if you see your street, if you see your town, if you go to London and look around, then whatever you see is there, of course. But there is more than this, in human life. What is that? People are now taking interest at that point of time in the minds of individuals. And how do you know what is going on in the mind? And if one is a woman, and if one is a woman born in a lower middle class or a middle class family, then this woman would have lots of restrictions on her, and restrictions mean that she will be always afraid. And if you are always afraid, if you can't say what you want to, what you think, then of course things will start happening inside you, and mostly it will be a world of fear. It will be a world of horror, because you are not allowed freedom in life, and that horror gets collected in the mind, in the imagination, in the sensibility of the person, and this horror builds its own kind of atmosphere in the mind of an individual. So Gothic is that which is connected with horror, which is connected with ghosts. And in England, there are few people. The population is not very dense in the rural areas, and if there are some houses, which have been left by the residents, and they are lying empty, then they would start saying, that at night some ghosts visit them, or there might be a fort next to a village or next to a town, and people at night would not go there. And sometimes, the sounds might come from these houses, maybe of birds, but people think that ghosts are there and they are dancing at night and all those things. So people, start building up a kind of an atmosphere in their own minds, which is not generally known. So this is what is Gothic. Gothic you can't understand. You're always horrified. You're always unhappy. You're always sad. You're always thinking about death. You're thinking about beings which are not human, and which don't resemble even the animals of the time, and yet you have to accept them because they reside in the mind of the person. So this is what is called Gothic, and this Gothic had become quite popular in the 19th century. And so far as this novel is concerned, you can say that it's to a large extent a Gothic novel. And if it's a Gothic novel, then you can't understand everything, you can't accept everything, and there are ghosts in this novel, and the writer herself feels, that there are spirits, or there might be things, that hover around your mind, your life, and that they have to be taken note of. So let me tell you the names of the important characters in this novel. There is a person called Heathcliff. There is a woman called Catherine Earnshaw. There is Hindley Earnshaw, Catherine's brother. There is Nellie Dean, she is the maidservant. There is Edgar Linton, that's a neighbor of these people. These people live on the higher side of the hill, and then in the valley there are other families, but from the hill to the valleys there is always kind of transport, there is always kind of give and take and exchange, and Edgar Linton lives in the valley. And Heathcliff, Catherine Earnshaw and Hindley, they live above. Then Isabella Linton, sister of Edgar Linton. Then there is Linton Heathcliff. Now that's a strange name. What do you think it is? How can Linton have that kind of a surname, Heathcliff? And Linton has married a Heathcliff. So Heathcliff's son from the Linton family, his wife is from the Linton family, and Heathcliff has married her, and the child is called Linton Heathcliff. Then Cathy Linton, this is the Linton woman who has married somebody. This is Catherine Earnshaw marrying Edgar Linton, and their daughter is called Cathy Linton. And then there is Lockwood. Now, before I talk about Heathcliff, let me tell you two things connected with this novel, which are apparently extraneous but very important for us to understand, because unless we understand these things, we won't understand the basic idea of the novel. What is the role of Lockwood and who is he? Because the novel starts with Lockwood. Lockwood is not a part of this group. Lockwood has come from outside, and he would stay at this place for a year. And then, he will see all these people or hear about them from somebody, and he is keeping a diary. So he is writing in his diary whatever he hears and whatever he sees, because he stays here and he is very curious about what's going on in this part of England, and he is keeping a diary. Now the writer says, that is Emily Bronte, that she doesn't know anything. She just found a diary written by Lockwood, and she is presenting that diary. So Lockwood, who is an outsider, came here, and he started taking notes, and he started also talking to people, and they would tell him that this was the story. So it is a story told by Lockwood. The novel is not written exactly by Emily Bronte. Of course, Emily Bronte is the writer, and she has created this character called Lockwood, but then the novel is within the book, it is written by Lockwood. So what does it mean? It means that whatever is there in the story is not according to the plan of Emily Bronte. Lockwood is telling everything. So who is the author then? The real author is Emily Bronte, but the virtual author, the author who has command over the whole thing is Lockwood. What would you call it? What kind of a novel is this? In English criticism, there is a word called narratorial fiction. Fiction told by a narrator. So there is a narrator. Now this narrator has a different kind of personality, and this is different from the writer. So there is a controversy in English criticism whether the novel should be considered as the writing of Emily Bronte or it would be an account of Lockwood. I am just leaving it there. I already introduced you. But then second thing is that Lockwood himself has been here only for a year, and he is telling a story which goes at least for 10 years. So how does he know what happened behind his back? Think about this. Well, he then, when he comes back, he meets this maid servant called Nelly, and he starts asking her about all these people, and then she tells him, because she has been there and she has been living at this place as a maid servant all her life, so she can tell. So it's a story told by Nelly largely to Lockwood, who in turn tells the story to us. So see the circle within circle, the wheel within the wheel. Nelly has seen something, she has said this to Lockwood. Lockwood would sit at night and would make an account of what he heard from Nelly, and that's how and when you write an account, don't you mix something of your own? You leave certain things, you add certain things from your imagination. Sometimes you didn't understand what Nelly said, but you thought that this is what she would have said, and therefore you put it, and that goes completely haywire. This is possible. So keep these two things in mind. One is that it's the story of Lockwood. Secondly, that the story has been told by Nelly to Lockwood. So there are two narrators in the novel, and then in that case the novel is not a real novel. It's not a realistic novel. It doesn't tell you what exactly happened. It only tells you what you are told by Lockwood and what Lockwood was told by Nelly. So this kind of a thing is there about this novel, and that makes it a very interesting kind of fiction, because if you have such a fiction, then you will be thinking about the reality and the unreality of the happenings that are captured in this novel. Finally, I come to the main story. The story is very patterned, and it has lots of twists, and the story also follows certain thematic aspects of life, and all that is is to be considered when you read the novel. So the hero of this novel is Heathcliff. And who is Heathcliff? All of us want to know who Heathcliff is. The writer gradually unfolds the inner life of Heathcliff in the pages of the novel. And what kind of a name is Heathcliff? Heath actually is a place where nothing grows, and cliff is the top of the mountain. So what does the name suggest? It's a name given to a boy by the family of Earnshaws, and therefore he becomes Heathcliff. Where did he come from? First thing, he is not an Englishman. The child came from outside. Where from did he come? He came from the working class colony of Liverpool in the 19th century. Mr. Earnshaw, Lord Earnshaw or Mr. Earnshaw once went there, and he saw a child sitting on in the street somewhere, and the child didn't know anything and didn't know where he had to go, and Earnshaw thought that this child can be taken to his home, and then he'll be brought up by the family of Mr. Earnshaw. So Heathcliff is taken as a child of 3 or 4 to this place, and then he will grow up here. And he's a black child. He's not exactly a white child. He's not an Englishman. Nobody knows where he came from. So he's just picked up from there and brought to this place in northern England, somewhere in the mountains above the valley. And what should we do about him? This child will finally grow. Does he belong to this family? will he be taken as an equal of the family? If he is not taken as an equal of the family, would he be called a servant? And he would learn the language of the members of the family that he has joined, and then there will be clashes within the family between Heathcliff and the children. So that's how the novel will proceed. I've introduced the novel to you generally first, and then I've said a few things about Heathcliff, who will be the hero and who will be a part of the larger conflicts of the family that is supposed to be living there, is moving around, is learning, is influencing the lives of others, and that's how the story is about to develop around the experiences of Heathcliff.